Today's topic is trade, investment, and industrial policy, green industrial policy. Before the session, I have some announcement to make in terms of logistics. As you know, we have 1 month ahead to finish the course. This is the 8th session, and we have 9 and 10 session, and then we come to the final session. And in order to have the participate certificate, you will be required to write a short reflection report about 800 to 1,000 words. So not very long, about 2 pages also. And you will be answering 2 questions. First, what is the most important issue at your organization or your city or your country in terms of energy transition? And second, what is your plan or proposal to address? Very short, very concrete idea and action that you want to take after taking this training course. So 2 questions in 2 or 3 pages maximum. You will have 2 weeks to write that report. So after finishing the course in the end of June, you have 2 weeks until 15th of July to write the report. And that's the requirement for having the certificate of participation. If you have any questions, please send email to Ms. Tien Lê, who is a course contact and also the facilitator for today's session. Okay. Today's session, we are honored to have Dr. Emma Esbeth, Associate Professor at the Australian National University. Dr. Emma Esbeth is an internationally well-known expert in energy, environmental policy. Also, she has done a lot of research and consulting work for the World Bank United Nations on trade, investment, and green industrial policy, the topic that she will be sharing with us today. So very interesting topic, and we have a great speaker today. We will also have Ms. Tien Lê from FS to facilitate session today. With no further ado, I would like to introduce and invite Dr. Esbeth to start the session today.
Thank you very much, Tung, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be talking to such a really impressive group of people from our region. I think the topic today is likely to be a little bit different from some of the other topics in this course. So please feel free to let me know if it's, you know, there's no such thing as dumb questions. The content in this today may well be quite different to what you're used to. So please do let me know if I need to step back a moment and explain things a little more clearly for them to make sense. As Tung mentioned, we'll be talking about international trade, investment, and green industrial policy. And these are all themes that are very closely related to each other and are emerging to be very important, both in terms of economics and policy, particularly in light of some of the developments in the global economy and the implications of the war in Europe at the moment. So our learning objectives today, by the end of today's session, I'm hoping that participants know what we mean by trade, investment, and green industrial policy in the context of the energy transition, that they understand the importance of trade and investment to the energy transition, that they're aware that some of the traditional trade and investment policy advice is actually in conflict with some of the needs from a policy perspective for energy transition, and that includes green industrial policy. and that you all have examples of trade and investment policy that is compatible with the green industrial policy and with energy transition. The outline for today, we'll talk at first about what are these concepts, what is renewable energy trade, foreign direct investment, and green industrial policy, and why do they have a role to play in the energy transition. Then we'll talk about policies to support each of those things, particularly trade and investment policy for the energy transition, and contrast that with some of the traditional policy advice in these areas. Then towards the end, I'd like to talk about two particular elements which receive a lot of attention of what we call trade-related climate policy, and that is CBAMs, which is an acronym standing for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which you probably know the European Union and others are considering, and also the certification of green goods, and hydrogen is the leading example of this. Now, in between each of these major sections today, I'd like to offer the opportunity to pause and raise some questions and have a discussion as a group. And then we'll also hopefully have some time for discussion at the end as well. All right, so renewable energy trade, what and why? This is actually a topic which you may have already covered. In fact, I know you have covered in one of the previous lectures. So just to go over that review from that session 4, what we mean about renewable energy trade is trade across national borders in renewable electricity or other energy carriers such as hydrogen. So Laos, for example, is a big exporter of renewable energy from hydroelectricity plants. There are also other future developments that are quite likely to emerge, and Australia is actually very interested in some of these. So you've probably heard in the previous session about the Sun Cable proposal, which proposes to export solar energy generated in the Northern Territory of Australia via Indonesia to Singapore. But direct electricity trade is, of course, not the only way, not the only way that we can do renewable energy trade. Renewable energy might also be embedded in other energy vectors, and hydrogen or its form of ammonia are the leading examples of those. And Australia has already exported some forms of hydrogen to Japan, but unfortunately that's actually hydrogen that's made from coal. But we're in discussions with all sorts of partner countries about making green hydrogen from renewable electricity and exporting that around the world. So you've probably also already considered in session 4 some of the advantages and reasons or motivations for renewable energy trade. But perhaps they've been discussed from a more engineering perspective. Today, I'd like to talk about some of the advantages of renewable energy trade from an economics perspective. The same motivations apply here as they do for trade in general. We know that trading with each other can lower the costs of us getting things in our economy. There are a couple of reasons that trade helps us to lower the cost of the energy in this case. Comparative advantage is one of them. If countries that are relatively well endowed and relatively abundant with renewable energy produce a lot of that renewable energy, they can make it relatively more cheaply than other countries. For example, countries that have perhaps not as much sun or very high population densities and not so much room for the renewable energy installations. We can also get cost advantages coming from economies of scale. Sometimes these big mega scale investments or projects can produce energy at a lower average cost than a series of smaller investments. So both comparative advantage and economies of scale can help lower the cost. These are traditional arguments in favour in trade for any good or product. We also know from session 4 that there are particular cost advantages for renewable energy, and that is when we can trade with each other, particularly when it comes to renewable electricity across borders, we can get geographical averaging advantages which lower the need for storage in our 100% renewable energy system. And of course, storage is relatively expensive compared particularly to solar and wind energy. The other advantage, aside from cost, of engaging in renewable energy trade is to lower our risk. So there are both political and physical risks involved, and we know that energy security is increasingly a very hot topic. So the physical risk is lower if we're trading with each other and if we have a broad trading network, because we have a greater diversity of sources. We all know that unfortunately the impacts of climate change are already being felt, and they're going to get stronger over time. And those impacts, like floods, typhoons, drought, heat waves, and cold snaps, all increase the physical risks and both the demand and supply risks on our energy systems. Having a broader geographic diversity of sources helps to average things out and lower those risks. We also know that there can be political risk, both internally but also geopolitical risk, from being heavily dependent on one source. And for this reason, if we have broad trading partnerships, we can lower the political power of whoever is in control of those energy sources, and also lower our geopolitical risk. And this, of course, is the importance of having these broad trading relationships has been particularly highlighted by the war in Europe at the moment. The good news, of course, is that renewable energy resources are much more broadly distributed around the world than fossil fuel resources are. So this allows us to have a more broad and diverse trading relationships in renewable energy than we traditionally have seen for fossil fuels. So what about foreign direct investment in renewable energy? This is something which is really closely connected, particularly to large export opportunities, but also foreign direct investment has a role to play in energy developments that are only focused at domestic supply. So foreign direct investment occurs when some foreign owner of capital or a multinational corporation not only puts some money into an investment that's occurring in your domestic market, but actually has a sort of a substantial interest. So by some definitions, it's 10%, by other definitions, it's 50% ownership of the actual project or company involved in your country. And so this means they're providing more than just some cash. They're also providing some knowledge and other sort of assets to the investment. There is a lot of foreign direct investment in energy assets around the world and around our region. There, a leading example, Chinese ownership of Lao electricity generators. In Australia, we have a lot of foreign direct investment in our energy as well, and particularly there's going to be a lot in those sort of mega scale export oriented projects in Australia. So we have Intercontinental Energy, we have Sun Cable having foreign partners as well. Hydrogen and ammonia production, again, really export focused. CWP Renewables is a multinational corporation who are leading the Asian Renewable Energy Hub in the northwest of Australia, which you may have heard of in a previous lecture. Fortescue Future Industries also have a lot of international involvement. So what is the motivation? We see a lot of this foreign investment. What drives and what is the motivation for foreign direct investment in renewable energy? One, of course, is project financing, and particularly in the wake of the COVID pandemic, we're finding that investment there's a lot of competition for investment at the moment. Governments are needing to borrow money to build up their economies and keep them going after COVID. Everyone around the world is trying to do the investments required for their net zero transition. And so one of the advantages of foreign direct investment is that multinational firms can bring their capital and their deep pockets into your economy. They can do that either through their own equity or from the fact that having a large multinational partner can help encourage confidence from investors and banks in projects. Multinational corporations, who are the ones who are engaging in foreign direct investment by definition, also tend to have very good global networks and downstream value chains and customer networks. And so this is particularly important for export-oriented projects, where sometimes it can be hard to get the financing going because you can't demonstrate yet that you have off-takers, that you have buyers for your product. Multinational investors will often bring those downstream supply chains, those off-takers, with them as part of their involvement in a project. One of the leading sort of arguments in favour of foreign direct investment across a whole range of products, not only energy, is technology transfer. And we know that a lot of leading edge technologies and technology developments are going to be needed for the energy transition. So this is an area where the technology transfer is one of the really strong motivations for the foreign direct investment. Multinational corporations will often bring their leading edge technology, frontier technology, and also management know-how with them when they get involved in a project. Last but not least, in the context of the energy transition, is actually the lobby power and the ability to help persuade governments that multinational corporations possess. We often think of this as one of the negatives to multinational corporations and foreign direct investment. But when it comes to helping to break the political power of vested fossil fuel interests, that really strong lobby power of multinational corporations involved in renewable energy can be a real asset. So that's trade and foreign direct investment. What is this green industrial policy, which possibly some of you may have never heard of, where I'm sure you've heard of trade and investment before. So what is this, and why is it something that we're increasingly seeing as associated with the energy transition? So green industrial policy comprises sector-targeted policies that support the growth and development of certain industries and technologies with the aim of furthering both economic and environmental goals at the same time. So essentially, in this context, industrial policy, which is targeted at energy transition and renewable energy sector, is green industrial policy, because it is both aiming to get the economic gains of getting the industry going and to get the environmental gains of helping us transition to net zero. Green industrial policy is becoming really popular, and we're seeing it emerge all over the world. So we know, some countries have these entire packages of green industrial policy, which involve, strategies, plans, and a whole lot of instruments. South Korea and the European Union are examples of this sort of approach. Many countries, if they don't have a whole of economy new Green Deal, will have hydrogen strategies. Hydrogen is very hot at the moment. So Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand are just a few of the examples from this region of countries which have hydrogen strategies. Many other countries maybe don't have overall plans, strategies, or packages, but might have particular instruments, policy instruments that we can think of as green industrial policy instruments. So in Australia, we have the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. These are essentially examples of green banks, and green banks are a particularly helpful instrument of green industrial policy, because they can help to finance those high risk initial projects that really can get a sector going where the other investors are too nervous to get involved. Other quite common approaches or green industrial policy instruments are things like subsidies and price guarantees. Feed-in tariffs for renewable energy are an example of green industrial policy in this context. So what is the motivation for green industrial policy? There are actually quite a lot of them. Economists would consider green industrial policy as a means to address market failures that restrict industry growth. Now, market failures is an economic concept that you may or may not be familiar with. What that means is really anything about the economic system which means that the market is not behaving as efficiently as it could. So, for example, credit constraints which are preventing, what would otherwise be good investments from happening are an example of a market failure. Imperfect information, where investors may be willing to invest in a project if they actually could be confident that they knew all the information about it and that they could trust the information about it. Similarly, buyers may be willing to buy green hydrogen if they knew for sure that it was clean green hydrogen and not some form of dirty hydrogen. Network externalities are another example of market failures, where, for example, everyone could benefit from better transmission, but because it has some sort of club good features that everyone can benefit from, no one may be willing to make as much investment as they should. And learning by doing, or dynamic economies of scale, when we know always in new industries, it's hard to do it first. Everything that we do in our own lives, we always learn by doing, and we get better at things over time. And while that's not a problem for an individual, it is when there are spillovers from that learning, where the fact that I've gone in and done something new in the economy generates knowledge that you can use and benefit from, and I can't capture all of those benefits from my knowledge spilling over to you. This is also a form of market failure. So green industrial policy can be targeted to fix those market failures that would otherwise restrict the efficient development of these new industries. Another way that economists think about green industrial policy is as a form of second best environmental policy. So for many decades, economists have argued that the optimal or first best approach to the climate change problem is to put a price on greenhouse emissions, a carbon price. And this is what's called the Pigouvian or optimal approach to the externality, that is the sort of impacts of our carbon emissions that affect third party people. As we know, however, this first best approach can face a lot of political barriers for a lot of reasons in different countries. And so we haven't seen it being adopted in many, many places, and certainly nowhere in the world is the carbon price currently at the true social cost that it needs to be at. And so economists think of this green industrial policy as an alternative way of getting the changes that we need in our economies, given that there are these political barriers to the first best policy of carbon pricing. There are two other drivers that we're also seeing for green industrial policy. One of those is technology competition. I think there's broad agreement from all the major technology leading countries in the world that green technology will be essential in the future. And they also believe that the dynamic economies of scale mean that the first movers, the countries that get a head start in this area, will have advantages in being the ones where the production and development of these technologies is located in the future. And so a lot of countries are seeing investments in green industrial policy as a way of helping their industries get that head start and have that first mover advantage. And last but certainly not least, green industrial policy is part of what we might think of as a build back better sort of approach to fiscal stimulus following crises such as the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis. So governments know in times of crisis that if they can spend money in the economy, they can help to stimulate the economy again and generate more growth. And green industrial policy often involves subsidies and government investment. And so it can be a sort of a particularly productive way, a win-win way of governments injecting money in the economy and stimulating it. Green industrial policy, of course, is really a special case of the broader concept of industry policy. And industry policy, you may or may not know, has actually a very long, decades and decades long history. And there were, in fact, many decades when economists in particular were really critical of industry policy. And the concern was that the government failures from the government capture by the industries that they're subsidizing is even worse than the market failures that it was supposed to fix. And so it's really important, if countries are engaging in green industrial policy, that they follow some good principles to help to ensure that those government failures don't really undermine and lead it to become actually worse than the market failures. And so there have been several papers written about this. A leading author in this regard is Danny Roderick, and he talks about a number of ways of ensuring that we do green industrial policy correctly. One of those, interestingly, is actually embeddedness. So governments cannot design good green industrial policies unless they have the information that they need, unless they really understand the industries involved and the market failures involved. And so what that requires is then deep information exchange and communication between government and industry, and I would also argue, and researchers. And this helps to overcome the information asymmetry problems that would otherwise plague the green industrial policy. But of course, this embeddedness only makes the potential for capture by the industry even greater. And so we need a whole series of things to try and counteract the potential for the industries that are being supported to capture government policy. One of those is accountability towards the public. We need transparency and accountability to ensure that it's harder for the governments to be captured by the industry. We need systematic learning. So a lot of commentators actually see green industrial policy as, if anything, as a pathway to learning. The whole purpose is that the government is learning together with the industry about these new industries. And so what that means is that we need processes in place whereby the government can systematically take lessons from the industry policy as it is doing it. And it also needs to be able to implement changes in light of those new learnings. And we'll get back to that point a little later today. Last but certainly not least is some form of discipline. It needs to be the case that the government will remove support policies if they are not successful or if they've actually already achieved their goals and so are no longer needed. And as we know, this can be one of the hardest things. And one of the reasons that people are so concerned about industry policy is that once we give supports to certain industries, it can be very hard to remove them again, even if it's then proven that that support was unhelpful or not necessary. All right, so I've done a lot of talking now. I'd like to hand over to Tien to help us with the discussion. I think what I might do is just show you a couple of slides with some questions to get us going, and then I'll hand over to you to facilitate, if that's okay. So the sort of questions I would be interested in are really examples of all of the things that I've been talking about from your respective economies, examples of renewable energy trade, both existing and future things that are being discussed, examples of foreign direct investment in renewable energy, both current and future, and finally, examples of green industrial policy. And one thing that I'd also be interested in is what people think are both the drivers and the impediments to all of these things, to the trade, the foreign investment, and the green industrial policy. So I'll go on mute now and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you for helping us understanding the concept and the rationale of trade, investment, and the green industrial policy. So everyone, if you want to answer Emma's question, please put, you can either put your answer in the chat or you can raise your hand. Maybe we can also invite some people from each country to answer this question. Oh, Emma, do you want to please show your presentation of the questions again? So in case some people miss the questions. So the question we have here is, could you please give some examples of trade or the, foreign direct investment or green industrial policy from your countries? Maybe Emma, people will take some time to put the answer in the chat box. So maybe if may I have like a question for you regarding the trade and investment in the policy. So maybe I will have a question in general about challenges and like obstacles for the government to in this different stage, like during the stage to introduce the policy to stimulate trade and direct foreign direct investment in the country, and the obstacle maybe when they implement the policy, what we should call, for example, cautious about.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and I wonder almost if I should, so the next part of the session today, I will actually talk about the trade and investment policy. And so I wonder if we should maybe just go on to that and people can continue to think about the examples that they know of while we talk about that. And then we can sort of do a combined discussion after we've talked about the policies to support trade and investment. Does that sound like a good idea? All right. Sorry, I just need to close a blind here. It's getting a bit hot in here. Is it possible to check that people can understand me all right? Am I speaking sufficiently clearly?
From my perspective, yes. We have,
okay. All right, great, thank you. I did warn that this topic is quite different to some of the other topics in the course, so it might take people a while to get their head around it.
So we have a few comments in the chat. So for Indonesia, currently are developing our own carbon tax and trading scheme. However, my personal concern is the lack of international common standard for carbon trading tax and trading scheme. This may lead to trade restriction among developed countries and developing countries. This is your question. So what is your text for that? I can't be involved in live discussion since I am currently in a meeting.
Okay. So I think it is an excellent question, but I think it's one that might be best if we return to it, if you can help remember for me, Tien, at the end, because it's relevant to the policy we're going to talk about. It's also relevant to both the certification and the carbon border adjustment mechanism topics that we're going to cover. So I think it's a really good point, and probably one that's best to come back to after we covered those parts of the session. So I see we have a raised hand.
Oh, yes. May I invite Miss Ngọc Đặng from Vietnam? Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Emma, for very well. I think presented with a lot of content regarding to the policy for renewable energy development. Also, in my countries, I think the green industrial policy have taken to place in several years up until now, and a lot of policy that implemented from the government. First of all, we can see that the feed-in tariff. So for wind or solar power, and we have also for the tax incentive for the corporate income tax. For example, for the oil investor in renewable energy, they can have a preferential tax rate like 10% for 50 years of operation compared to 20% for others industry. So I see it's not distinct when you compare to the FDI with the domestic firms, but it's kind of the overall preferential policy for all of investors in renewable energy. And I think in the future, government have to thinking of how to invest, how to attract investment from FDI flow to the LNG or hydrogen in the long-term future and so on. But yeah, I see up until now when the tax incentive and feed-in tariff, other feed-in tariff now is quite the controversial issue in Vietnam. Yeah, so that's my idea.
Thank you very much. They're both excellent examples of green industrial policy in this area. Are you able to explain a little bit about why the feed-in tariff is currently controversial? Is it about the level of the feed-in tariff?
Yeah, I think have many reasons, but one of the reasons is that the feed-in tariff for solar power, for example, for rooftop solar and for the solar farm is quite high in Vietnam because the technology development makes the cost of generation is down year by year or even monthly. So when the government try to contract for 15 or 20 years, it's quite long for them, and they feel that it's costly to have that kind of long contract. And today they kind of to cut off all the feed-in tariff and to become another policy incentive. And this is also controversial between the government policymaker with a corporate, because they say that it's not incentive for them to invest like 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and they just to wait and to kind of lack of accountabilities from the investor point of view for the government, because they think that the government has a short side view of the policy investment interest and so on. So I think it's kind of the feed-in tariff happen not only in Vietnam, but other developing countries like India. They have a kind of—
Thank you. And that is actually a really excellent example of why we need to learn and to update our green industrial policies, because things change over time, and the massive decrease in the cost of renewable energy generation is an excellent example of why what was the correct green industrial policy 10 years ago, the correct level of feed-in tariff is no longer the correct level now. And this is the importance of being able to change those feed-in tariffs, as we talked about on this slide, right? Exactly the sort of thing we're talking about. And also the political difficulty, as you're saying, the pushback from industry when the government tries to change those policies. And so that's exactly the sort of issues that we're talking about. A little bit later, we'll talk about an extra issue that can happen when these changes interact with foreign investment, and particularly with a form of investment policy, which is called an investment treaty. And so I will mention that Spain, so it's not only developing countries who face this issue, all governments are grappling with this sort of long time periods, the lock-in, the expectation of a certain feed-in tariff, and then dramatic decreases in the price or the cost of generation. And so Spain actually found they got far too much uptake of their generous feed-in tariff, and they were actually facing financial crisis overall in the economy. And so the IMF actually said, you need to reduce the feed-in tariff, and they did do that. But what happened then was they got sued for about 40 billion euros by the industry for that change. And so this gets to one of the problems about the intersection between foreign investment policy and green industrial policy that I'm going to talk about in a little while. I see we have another hand raised.
Question related to the content about the FDI invest in the transition line and generation, because in there you on the example you have in there it relate to the time of the generation, but I consider about the energy security when investing from the especially FDI in the transition etc. But you have not mentioned, for example, in Vietnam right now we only first the law only allow for invest. I mean that the invest in the transmission line will be the monopoly of the government. Right now they only have the new set apply for investing for the private sector, but it's not have the clarification about how to invest yet, but not mentioned to the FDI. So I just want to add the best practice in here, that is it allowable for the policy to invest in the transition or just only the generation, because most of the you said in here it relate to the generation, not to specify about the cyber security for transitions.
That's another really excellent question. And energy security is, of course, a really hot topic, and the transmission is at the heart of that, particularly, if we're talking about pipelines or electricity cables. Whoever controls the pipeline or the cable can sort of switch it off, and that means a lot of risk at either end. It would be a huge risk for someone to make a big generation investment, and meanwhile the transmission be controlled by the off-taker, who can then just switch it off and say, no, thank you, I don't want it anymore. On the other hand, it would be a huge risk for an off-taker to be very dependent on a pipe or a cable, and that transmission be owned by the other side, and have the generator say, actually, we're just not going to send anything down there. So what you get is this two-sided risk or two-sided holdup. And there are many possible different approaches to that. One is that governments want to control these because they're essentially security, part of the national security, is for the government to control those. On the other hand, joint investment can be a way of helping to ameliorate that two-sided risk. So if both sides have some, ownership of that transmission line, then that sort of protects both of them somewhat. So you're absolutely right. This is, particularly also for the electricity lines, there's not only the sort of the power to switch off the lights, but there's also the issue of electricity lines being a potential means for cyber attacks to travel through and then take out, the entire energy system at the other end of the line. So these are real national security questions, and I think for that reason, you will see a lot of governments being reluctant to allow too much foreign investment in the actual transmission components, which is, I think, what you're saying.
I think, and that is quite clear, easy to see the public-private partnership related to the other project like the transmission. Transportation, etc. Do you see any example related to the public-private partnership related to the transmission project like that in the world? When you second can share the cost and also the responsibility to control the security.
Yeah, absolutely. So public-private partnerships have always been a means, particularly in sensitive sectors, for the governments to have some control, but also it helps foreign investors feel like they are less in danger of being expropriated or nationalized if they just from the outset have some government ownership involved. So that is definitely one of the pathways. The other twist on this is, I guess, the role of state-owned enterprises. So I don't know where any negotiations are at, so please don't quote me. I'd be fascinated if some of our Indonesian participants today knew more about this, but I understand that there was at least some contemplation of the Indonesian state-owned energy corporation, PLN, being involved or investing in potential transmission from Australia to export to Indonesia or Singapore via Indonesia. I have no idea. That was through sort of the rumor mill a few years ago. I have no idea what the latest is on that sort of position. So I would be fascinated if anyone knows anything that they can say publicly. Perhaps they don't about that. But yeah, public-private partnerships or sort of SOE, state-owned enterprise, and private foreign investor are one of the ways that you try to, as I said, reduce that two-sided hold-up problem by sort of being in it together and both having some controlling interest in the particularly sensitive investment. But I would love to hear examples. And I'm sure there are some in the region, actually.
Thank you very much, Emma. We have another question, answer coming from a participant from the Philippines about the example in the Philippines. So in the Philippines, we have policy mechanisms such as RPS, feed-in tariff, green energy option, net metering, and others. So we are also finalizing the policy for green energy option. So if we have any other participant from the Philippines want to raise your hand and maybe give provide us some more information about the policy in the Philippines, that would be great.
Excellent. And so that seems, yes, these seem to be the most common example, is these sort of policies to encourage more renewable energy generation to be built in the countries. I'd be very interested if anyone knows about any sort of green bank, or I think we already had some example of things like tax breaks or low interest loans to help encourage high risk investments to take place. I don't know if anyone has examples of those.
We have Miss Ngọc Đặng from Vietnam. Raise her hand.
Thank you so much. As far as from my understanding is that for Green Bank in Vietnam, we have a major bank, like commercial banks. They have the loan dedicated for the renewable energy development, but I don't see that they have kind of very low rate. I mean, it's that low interest rate for this, because renewable energy in Vietnam consider is a risky investment area, because with the not stabilities of the policy, that the banks consider that the renewable energy projects have a higher risk, and they want to lend for that program or for the projects, but the interest rate is quite high, even higher than the average rate of other industry. So besides the commercial banks, we have the international development banks like World Bank or ADB. They have a different type of the lending, and this is more lower interest rate compared to a domestic bank, but the projects have to face with the foreign exchange rate risk. So I see that it's quite difficult for the project in Vietnam to find a preferential interest rate to implement their project. So yeah, it's a problem. Yeah, I think so.
Thank you. So it sounds like it's an area where it could be helpful if the government engaged in more green industrial policy of this type to provide some green bank or preferential credit for these environmental but high risk projects. And yeah, thanks for raising the role of the development banks. They can somewhat sort of help overcome this problem, but as you say, it's quite limited, and they can only get involved in really big things. So to get small and medium-sized projects going in your country, you really do need either national or sort of state or regional green banks to get involved, because as you said, that they're high risk, so the private lenders don't offer particularly good rates. Thank you.
Emma, for Indonesia, we received a piece of information and also a question related to the national determined commitment and around the problem of counting carbon mitigation of the country. So there's a dilemma that whether the country want to export renewable energy electricity or claim it for their NDC. On the other hand, the amount of affordable RE sources is rather limited. So do you have any insight or suggestion about this dilemma?
Look, that's an excellent question. There's two answers. So one is, if there is mutual trade that could happen, and we have those benefits of the geographic diversity and the lower storage needs, then it can be a win-win, because you might be exporting at times when there's a lot of sun or a lot of wind in your country, but you're importing at other times, and that can help lower the cost and ease the transition for everyone and help everyone to meet their contributions and their targets. The other question about capacity that could otherwise be used to decarbonize the domestic grid being instead directed at export projects is a really excellent point, and it's one that we're facing in Australia. So Fortescue Future Industries, for example, are wanting to use some of the hydro from Tasmania, not just some, a lot of the hydro from Tasmania, and wind to make hydrogen to export. alternatively, what we could do is build a better connector between Tasmania, which is an island at the bottom of Australia, and the mainland, which is where most of the demand is. And so we're also facing that same challenge. And this is where ultimately good government policy is required. So the government, you know, once again, we have this network externality for the lack of the transmission to the mainland, which is artificially lowering the price of the renewable energy that's generated in Tasmania. So if sort of we had clear-sighted government policy that would build the transmission that we need, then the price would adjust, you know, and they would get the price that they need and deserve for what it can do to help Australia decarbonise. And then we can see, okay, well, is there really any excess renewable energy in Tasmania that we should be exporting to the rest of the world? On the other hand, we have other projects which are way up in the northwest of Australia, a long way from load centres and population centres, where we have incredible, you know, world-class renewable energy resources, that it would be really expensive to build transmission between that far top west corner of Australia and the load centres southeast. And so those export opportunities are really additional, and they're not at risk of, you know, taking away from our own decarbonisation needs. And so it's not always going to be the case that it's a zero-sum game, but sometimes it will be, and then you need good policy that at least ensures that the renewable energy investors are getting fair access to help connect to the national grid to help decarbonize it.
Thank you, Emma, for excellent answer and a lot of examples. We have another participant from the Philippines to raise hand. And do you want to take? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. May I invite?
Hello. I'm interested in that concept of the green banks, because here in our province, for example, we already have like a solar company that was auctioned off by the bank because of like the experience of Vietnam. Well, said because of the high interest rates and the requirements being asked from companies, energy companies. So, and there's also the problem here of the messaging of renewable energy that should be, I think it should be holistic, because right now it's just like on a piecemeal basis. Like right now we are looking at energy transition, etc. So the enablers coming from especially our local governments who will be approving the projects, and of course the investors who will be coming in, you know, they need to situate where they are. So it's like we wanted to have a holistic view and even on overall framework on how we're going to approach it, which would situate other enablers like financing, capacity building, the structures and the system. So that's where we are grappling at the moment. We recently held a renewable energy summit, and those were some of the issues that crop up because our local governments couldn't really understand, for example, how they could go about approving renewable energy. So if a foreign company would come in, like where they would, you know, they would be asking so many requirements, and they don't have like a guidebook or to address this, like a unified guidebook to address like even the energy planning and how to attract investments, etc. So I think that's one of the issues that was we are looking at right now.
Yeah,
in our province.
Thank you. That is another excellent intervention. So you know, when I talked about green industrial policy, and one of the market failures it was fixing was both these information asymmetries and these sort of network externalities or coordination failures. And that is the economic jargon for what you just described. And as you said, one form of green industrial policy, which I haven't mentioned, so thank you for raising it, is actually to have coherent plans which help solve the information problem, but also the coordination problem. So if the government has a plan for here's what our energy system will look like in 2050, and here is where we think there might be hubs of renewable energy, and this is where we're going to build the transmission to connect to the grid, then that gives the investors the confidence that they're investing in the right place and that they're not going to go and build something that is in a place that won't ultimately get connected to the national grid, for example. So having coherent strategy at both national and subnational levels and a plan is a very important part of energy transition or green industrial policy in this context. And it's one where I think, we can think about regional knowledge sharing and capacity building, where we can learn from each other's experience in developing these plans, and some of the leaders can share their experience. And also things like the multilateral banks, the Asian Development Bank can also, or the UN Trade and Development can also, do some knowledge sharing to help lower that burden, because we all have limited, resources, including bureaucratic resources in our economies. And so we really need to share our learnings to try and take on this huge task together.
Thank you, Emma. I think we don't have any questions related to this topic anymore, and there's still some questions, but can be asked later on. So please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for your engaged conversation. It's really been very interesting so far. So we've talked a little about green industrial policy. What about trade and foreign direct investment policy? Now, you may or may not be familiar with traditional trade policy advice, and that is to basically liberalize everything, to lower your tariffs, participate in trade agreements, or even just unilaterally of your own choice, lower your tariffs below what you've promised in trade agreements, to also try to remove non-tariff barriers to trade. So try to look for technical and safety requirements that might be actually, without meaning, being more of a barrier to trade than they need to be. So we don't want to remove technical and safety requirements, but maybe we can try and harmonize them with our trading partners and streamline regulatory processes. So this is traditional trade policy advice that applies to renewable energy as much as it does to any other area. What we are seeing is sort of a special area of trade policy that is emerging around climate, and I refer to it as trade-related climate policy. And so these are actually policies which are designed to support climate objectives, but which have trade consequences. And we're starting to see more and more of these. So leading examples include carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which a lot of particularly higher income countries, sort of decarbonisation leaders are thinking about. Preferential green goods liberalisation is a much, on the face of it, less controversial approach to trade-related climate policy. So if we preferentially lower tariffs on these climate-friendly or green goods, then we can have both a climate win and a trade win. And of course, APEC actually has the only list of green goods that has been agreed by any set of countries. And that was agreed way back in 2012. And they're actually considering expanding that list at the moment. And my team and I here at the ANU contributed to drafting a scoping paper about what might be some potential goods that could be included in that expanded list. And I'd be happy to share the link to that paper if anyone's interested. As with any form of trade liberalisation, you don't need to agree with anyone about what should be liberalised. You can also just lower tariffs and lower barriers to goods on your own, and that's called unilateral liberalisation. Another example of trade-related climate policy is certification schemes, so either green or low emissions certification schemes. And for example, anyone wanting to export to the European Union hydrogen will need to be able to certify that that hydrogen meets the regulatory requirements of the European Union. And so certification is a sort of a form of trade facilitation that helps to overcome those information barriers that might otherwise prevent trade. On the flip side, we also know that green industrial policy, or old-fashioned industrial policy, has often had trade policy consequences as well. The most well-known of that is what's called infant industry protection. So there was, for a long time, an argument that, given that there's learning by doing or dynamic economies of scale, our industry might be able to compete in a few years if we just protect it now while it's learning, and then we can learn within our domestic economy and lower its prices, and then we can let it go and it can compete on the international market. Of course, the problem that we have found through many decades is just how hard it is, A, to pick which industries will actually be able to be competitive in the long run, and B, whether they're competitive or not, to take away protection once you've given it to an industry is very, very difficult politically. And so the final thing to note is that infant industry protection, because it requires a certain, the learning, the dynamic economies of scale require a certain scale economy. And that means that if you're a small economy, if you protect your infant industry, it will never be able to compete because it's still too small. Your domestic economy is not large enough to get the economies of scale that your industry will need to compete ultimately. So really, infant industry protection is something that's theoretically possible, but it's definitely one of the more challenging aspects of green industrial policy, which relates to trade. So putting tariff barriers up to protect infant industries should only be done if you have really good information that suggests that that industry will ultimately be able to compete internationally, and also if you're confident that you will have the political power you need to remove that tariff protection after a few years once the industry is competitive, or even if it's not competitive and you learn you failed. Another, I think, worth mentioning interaction between green industrial policy and trade policy is what's called tariff escalation. So, and this is something that developing countries often, quite rightfully, accuse the developed countries of doing, and that is that they keep the tariffs low on the upstream products, on the raw materials, and they keep the tariffs high on the downstream products, the final consumer products. And this makes a whole lot of sense from the perspective of the countries who are doing it, because what they're wanting to do, if they want to develop that new industry, that downstream industry, what they want to do is protect its outputs, but they want to get it as possible, so they keep the tariffs low on those inputs. So while it makes a lot of sense to the country imposing it as part of their industrial policy, it can look really perverse and anti-development from the perspective of the other countries, because what countries like Australia and also other countries in the global south find is that they're then stuck, sort of caught in this trap of exporting the raw materials, and the upstream components of things, and it's much harder to break into those higher value things further downstream. All right, so what about foreign investment policy for the energy transition? Once again, there's a contrast between the traditional foreign direct investment policy advice and the sort of climate or energy transition friendly version. So what we know, and the traditional narrative, is that foreign investors are attracted by low risk environments which have good access to both input and output markets. So they can get cheap labor, cheap raw materials, cheap intermediate products, and they also can sell onward to other markets. So these are the main things that drive where foreign investors go. And so the policy advice is generally sort of manifold. One, to liberalize your energy markets to allow foreign ownership. So if you have an energy market that is dominated by a single state-owned enterprise and you don't have a competitive market, then you are very unlikely to attract foreign investment into your economy, into your energy sector. It also recommends that you liberalize your input markets, and that includes that you allow the foreign investors to import whatever goods or services, including labor, that they want to use, because that helps them get the cheap inputs that they know how to use. Another big one is to protect them from political risk, and that's particularly important in these sort of high risk, politically sensitive areas such as energy. And we've seen many examples over the decades of where foreign investors have come in and have done an energy investment, and then the domestic government has nationalized that investment or expropriated it. So doing things like signing up to investment treaties that help protect investors from having their investments expropriated is another of the traditional policy advice about how to attract foreign investment. There's also, of course, as we know, all sorts of financial risk, particularly for these new industries. And although that's no different for foreign or domestic investors, what we sometimes see is governments rolling out the red carpet to the foreign investors because of all the technology and knowledge spillovers that they bring with them, and sort of trying to provide lower financial risk environment for them, including through tax breaks and subsidies. So this is all the fairly traditional policy advice about how to attract foreign direct investment in anything, including energy. However, there are some serious clashes between this policy advice and what we need for the energy transition, in particular for green industrial policy. And the biggest of those clashes, in my view, is the International Investment Treaty regime. So I don't know if anyone has heard of investment treaties, bilateral investment treaties, or international investment agreements, as they're sometimes referred to. What these things do is governments sign up to say, essentially, I will not do anything, I will not change any policy in a way that harms foreign investors. And they have a dispute mechanism which is different to any trade agreements. So trade agreements have what's called state-to-state dispute settlement mechanisms, for example, the WTO. So if Australia doesn't like something that America did in terms of its trade policy, then the Australian government as a state can bring a case to the WTO. What investment treaties have is what's called investor-to-state dispute settlement. And this is really different. So what that means, if there's an Australian investor in America who doesn't like something the American government has done, that individual investor can essentially sue the US government for that policy change and for the profits that they lost as a result of that. And these things are really problematic, and they are leading to a lot of cases, a lot of the billion-dollar claims against various countries. So if you're not aware of this and you're involved in the energy transition policy, I recommend that you try and become aware of it, because governments can be exposed to these claims without really realizing that they are. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the Spanish government, when it tried to change its feed-in tariffs, was hit from various different investors for a total of around 40 billion euros worth of claims, and some of those have been successful. I think about $10 billion of claims have been successful that the Spanish government had to pay to those foreign investors. The German government was sued by a Swedish company, Vattenfall, when they tried to phase out nuclear, despite the fact that they had actually offered what they claimed was fair compensation to Vattenfall already. And a recent paper, and there's a link here in this slide, has estimated that governments risk up to $340 billion as governments around the world in investor claims under these investment treaties, just from doing the policies that they would need to do to phase out the oil and gas production that in line with the Paris 1.5 degree target. So these things really are quite problematic. And I realize I've removed from this version of the slide, but if you look at the resources for this session, there are various links, and have I got the link here to the OECD is the OECD is actually doing a whole project on changing investment treaties, reforming investment treaties, or maybe even removing investment treaties because of these sort of problems. And the first phase of that project is looking at the interaction with climate change. And on there is papers from the OECD, but also a whole lot of submissions from experts around the world about what we might be able to do to fix this problem. And I have one of the submissions, because my name's A, it's in alphabetical order. My submission is easy to find near the top of that, because I actually have developed with a co-author a proposal that could fix exactly this problem. So anyway, that's a really big topic, one that we don't have time to do justice to today, but I'm very happy if anyone would like to follow up with me either in the discussion or over email. Aside from investment treaties, one other piece of advice is to be careful with tax breaks for foreign investors, because there's real risk that host countries might bear the environmental and social costs from foreign direct investment without getting any of the economic advantages from it. And Australia, once again, as an example of that, we're sort of equal at the moment, or the last couple of years have been equal largest exporter in the world of liquefied natural gas. Yet we earn very little in the way of revenue from that many hundreds of billions of dollar industry, because of all the tax breaks that are built into our system. And so as we're developing new industries like hydrogen and ammonia export industries, the Australian government is certainly going to think very carefully about how to ensure we don't have a repeat of that situation we did with LNG. So that was the end of the sort of policy phase. I think we talked a little bit about some of this issues and topics during our last discussion, but it's probably not a bad time to pause for another chat, Tian, if you have time. So I've got just one slide really focusing. I'm happy to take questions on the trade and investment policy more broadly, but I would be fascinated to know if the participants have ever heard of these investment treaties before and had any idea about the potential trouble that they could cause for governments as they try and decarbonize their economies.
Everyone, if you want to answer Emma's question, please put it in the chat. or raise your hand.
So I'm actually not very surprised if no one has heard of them. It's a common problem. Yeah, so I don't know. It can be that people just think, if this was really such a problem, I would have heard of it before. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case. So I actually have another paper with a different co-author, which shows that governments actually continue to sign these treaties really happily, even though they see other countries getting sued by investors. Governments continue signing them happily until they get hit by a big claim themselves, and then all of a sudden they realize what the problem is. So and so this is a classic example of, it's only when countries have sort of been hit by a major claim themselves that they realize the potential danger that they've signed up to with all these treaties. So I'm trying to warn you in advance that it's particularly problematic, because if we think about, I'm not sure if the next slide talks about that. No, it doesn't. If we think about what I said that these treaties let the investors sue the government if they do a policy change that harms their profits. And then what did I say about green industrial policy? I said good green industrial policy means that you need to change your policy as you learn and as things change. And what that means is you will be hurting some people's profits if you are doing good green industrial policy. So there's this complete contradiction between what good green industrial policy is and what these investment treaties make governments promise to do. It is an issue, and Spain will not be the last country that is hit by this problem. All right, let's move on to topics that people probably have heard about. And I'd like to thank one of my colleagues, Dr. Wenting Cheng here, who prepared these slides for us today. And this is about carbon border adjustment mechanism. So there's a lot of detail that Wenting has put on this slide. In broad terms, carbon border adjustment mechanism can be thought of as really a tariff that is put on the border, like an extra tax at the border that is put on products that accounts for the fact that in the country where they were made, the carbon tax or the carbon price was lower than it is in the importing country. And the reasons why people economies such as the European Union want to put on these carbon border adjustments is twofold. One, of course, is a competitiveness concern. So the European producers argue, we have an emissions trading scheme. That means we pay a carbon price. That means it's more expensive for us to do things. And that means it's unfair if we have to compete against imports where they don't have a carbon price or where they don't have any serious carbon sort of policy mechanism. The other motivation is what's called an emissions leakage motivation. So once again, usually the industry will, but also the policymakers might say, well, if we have this price of carbon or price of emissions in our economy, it's harder for our industry to compete. So then the industries will actually just shift to countries that don't have a price of carbon and don't have any serious climate policy. And in the end, that isn't going to help the world at all, because the emissions will still happen. They just happen somewhere else. And so our carbon policy has been rendered useless from the perspective of mitigating climate change. So the competitiveness and the leakage arguments are the real arguments that are used to justify this carbon border adjustment mechanism. And indeed, in theory, in terms of economic theory, these carbon border adjustment mechanisms, if they're done well, are justifiable and they are efficient. Because what is, it's really just an extension of a carbon price. And we know that all the economists are recommending that a carbon price is the most efficient response to the climate externality. And so there is no problem with carbon border adjustment mechanism from the perspective of economic theory. Where it does become problematic is if countries who feel that they haven't done many emissions so far and they're not the cause of the climate problem are now being blocked from developing industries because they've been sort of blocked from these markets by countries who were, partly responsible for the climate mess that we're in. And so the impact of these carbon border adjustment mechanisms on developing countries is a really hot topic. So these slides, by the way, I'm not going to talk to them in detail because they're going into a whole lot of detail about the detail of how these mechanisms could be designed by the European Union. So if you're interested in that, by all means, go ahead. But I think for now, we'll focus on two things. One is the potential to harm developing countries. And so UNCTAD has actually, it's not here. I thought it was here. UNCTAD has actually done a study on which economies are likely to be most affected by European carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Because the extent to which and that's what this page is from, actually. This is looking at the impact on the least developed countries in thousands of euro. So down the left-hand side there are the sectors that the current European proposal is to include. So that's fertilizers, and most importantly, that means ammonia, which is actually one of the means that people are thinking about exporting hydrogen. It includes aluminium, iron and steel, and cement. And these are all major polluting industries. So you can't really criticize the European Union for their choice of industries. They all are actually quite logical in terms of being ones for which there are a lot of emissions associated. And so then the question is, well, how much, for Australia, the CBAM is actually not too much of a threat if these are the only products that are included, because we actually don't export any of these things to the European Union. So the first question is, does your country export a lot of these things to the European Union? If not, maybe don't worry too much for now. The second concern is that Europe is likely to expand the list of products over time, and other countries other than Europe are likely to start applying carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And indeed, what is the best response to this? Well, there are ways that you can avoid getting hit by a CBAM, and that is if you have some credible carbon price in your own economy. And in fact, the European Commission has been very clear that they don't actually want to put carbon border adjustment mechanisms on anyone's imports or exports. What they really want is to spur other countries to overcome their political problems with putting a carbon price on themselves. So I'm just looking at the time. I'll flick back here and then we'll move on to certification and leave time for discussion. One of the big challenges for the European Union and for anyone who's thinking about implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism is to ensure that they are compliant with trade rules, in particular WTO rules. And so what that essentially means is that the Europeans have to be very careful to design the CBAM in a way that it is no worse for the exporting countries than what the European producers face themselves. So, for example, the Europeans are proposing that the adjustment at the border, the carbon border adjustment, will match the emissions trading scheme price for the European emissions trading scheme. And it will match it, and will also apply to exactly the same sectors and the same products as the European emissions trading scheme applies to. So that's the basics of it. The other sort of more tricky thing for the Europeans is to ensure that it's no harder from an administrative and regulatory perspective for the exporters to prove what the right level of emissions charge should be than it is for the Europeans. And that is a trickier thing, because not all countries have, in fact, most countries don't have, no one really has good embedded emissions accounting systems that the producers can use to prove what their embedded emissions are. And this is particularly important if we want to encourage green industries. We need the potential for these new green industries to prove that actually, you know what, I made my steel is green steel. It doesn't have any embedded emissions in it. So you shouldn't be putting any carbon border adjustment mechanism on me. And so designing the rules so that we encourage these new green investments, and that the Europeans don't just assume that that steel is being made in the same polluting way that traditional steel is made, is one of the trickiest elements, and one of the areas where we really need regulatory collaboration. Which leads on to certification schemes, because certification schemes are one of the ways that you can prove to foreign regulators, domestic regulators, foreign investors, and foreign buyers the green and clean credentials of your products. So certification schemes are really taking off, particularly for hydrogen. So certification schemes in general are about solving information failures and establishing trust between buyers and sellers and investors and governments. And why does it matter for hydrogen, for example? We know that hydrogen, when it burns, produces water vapor, which it is actually a greenhouse gas, but there's so much of it in the air that burning the hydrogen isn't going to have an impact. But it doesn't produce any other greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. So hydrogen doesn't, when you burn hydrogen, from the perspective of your national contributions or your net zero commitments, you're not doing any harm when you're burning hydrogen. However, making hydrogen is a different story. The production of hydrogen can be essentially zero emissions if you do it all using electrolysis of truly additional renewable energy, and you do all the processing and compaction using renewable energy and the transport using renewable energy. If you don't, however, hydrogen can be very polluting, and I'm not sure. Yeah, so here this graph shows the emissions that are associated with hydrogen production if it's done from steam methane reforming of natural gas. And what you can see is you can get a lot of emissions from the feedstock when you extract the gas from the ground. You get emissions at the steam methane reforming phase when you turn the natural gas into hydrogen. What do? Is you release carbon dioxide. There's further, if you use that natural gas that you're got on hand to be the energy source for the conversion and compression, you produce more emissions, and similarly for the transport phase. So in fact, steam methane reforming, I'm not sure if I have that slide. No, I don't. I should add it. Is actually, other than 100% renewable energy hydrogen, one of the cleaner ones. Making hydrogen, you can also make hydrogen from coal, from black or brown coal, which is even dirtier than this. And dirtiest of all is to make hydrogen by connecting your electrolyzer to a grid that is supplied by fossil fuels, particularly coal. So the certification of hydrogen really matters if the trade in hydrogen is going to help us to decarbonize the whole world and not just lead to a massive leakage problem where countries with strict commitments switch from fossil fuels to hydrogen, but they buy that hydrogen from countries with slack commitments or poor reporting who are producing dirty hydrogen. So one of the issues with certification, though, is it is quite a detailed process, and there are many different ways that you can design a certification scheme, even for something as simple as hydrogen. And what we're seeing is a lot of different certification schemes being developed by different countries and different industries around the world. And so you're getting a lot of regulatory competition, but sort of regulatory complexity and confusion, therefore, for the producers and the participants in the hydrogen market. And so some of the things that we work on is actually about how to get some more uniformity as far as possible, and how do we design certification schemes and the certification regime so that it is no more complicated and no more of a regulatory burden than we need, so that we're not locking out anyone from markets by simply having too many layers of regulatory complexity. Sorry, I forgot to mention these slides. She doesn't have a name on it anymore. These slides were prepared by another of my colleagues, Dr. Lee White, who I believe spoke to you just last session about energy efficiency. So thank you to Lee for those slides. Okay. Right. So I think it's time for, we've got a little bit of time for discussion before I do a little summary at the end. So questions on CBAM, certification, foreign investment policy, anything we've covered today.
Thank you very much, Emma. Regarding the EU CBAM, we have the perspective from Indonesia. So I think you already discussed this, but I wonder if you want to add more information. So a participant who are from the Ministry of Trade from Indonesia, he thinks that the CBAM is more like an instrument for related to protectionism, and like with restriction in implication for the developing countries, it may be just again a rich countries club trading on over again and restrict import from the developing country who didn't have that advanced technology in green energy.
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah, thank you. I think all of my questions mainly heavy on the CBAMs, because right now this is like a hot issue for us Indonesians. And since I work for the Ministry of Trade, we view that CBAM as a form of protectionism and discriminatory with a green policy objective as it disguised. Because if CBAM were implemented by the EU and adopted by other developed countries, us Indonesians and also maybe other developing countries will be having difficulties to export our products to the EU or other developed countries that may adopt the CBAM scheme. Because right now, developing countries didn't have any technological levels or energy scheme that at par with the EU or other developed countries. So that for us, the main criticism for CBAM is that it will be discriminatory, it will be protectionism, and it be a discouragement for us developing countries to develop our own green policy or green energy scheme, because if we cannot export our green products to the EU because of the CBAMs, what will we use for our economics then. The second thing that you mentioned about the FDI in green policy and so on, but right now the EU views that FDI, mainly from China, as a subsidy that can be blocked using countervailing duties instruments under the WTO framework. So it can be a discouragement for the host countries that enjoy the FDI from the China to develop their own green energy policy and green energy industry, because the EU, other than CBAMs, will block such product that enjoying the investment from China or maybe other countries as a subsidy, and it will be blocked using the CVD. This is already done to the Egypt and already done to Indonesia too. So it will be like it will be the same for us Asian countries probably, because Asian countries, probably a lot of Asian countries nowadays enjoying FDI from China. Just to say about that. So we need, I think we need more discussions, not only to develop our own national energy scheme, but how to develop the global common standards on investment, on energy scheme, and so on. So it cannot be blocked by arbitrary policy by some developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting set of questions. Where to begin? I guess one question is the basis on which you say something is discriminatory. If the European producers have to pay the same costs for emissions, then it is technically not discriminatory and not inefficient. What I do think is a potential issue, though, which I mentioned to you earlier, is if it's harder for the exporting countries to prove what their carbon emissions are, or to get acknowledgement for the potentially implicit costs that they have paid towards climate mitigation. And so the US, for example, is really pushing hard on this. So the US is unlikely to politically be able to get a carbon price at the national level itself. But what they are able to do is sort of other regulatory measures towards decarbonisation. But those measures, the US wants to argue, are equivalent to a carbon price. And so they want to be able to sort of lower the CBAM that they face, or even remove it on the basis of a set of policies that are equivalent to a carbon price. The problem is that not everyone has the bureaucratic resources that the United States have to sort of make the case that their industries should be exempted or have a lower CBAM. And so that will be a really interesting thing going forward as we see how the US and the EU negotiate over that point. Something that I'm involved with the Australian government is looking at developing embedded emissions accounting schemes, and it's to get to that point about encouraging, making sure that CBAMs don't discourage green industries. So one thing that governments can do is help to provide frameworks through which their industries can prove what their embedded emissions are. So if I make, as I said, green steel or green aluminium, and the Australian government has a good framework for helping me prove what those carbon embedded emissions are, and to prove that they're low, and therefore that I shouldn't get a carbon border adjustment mechanism, then the green industries in your country will actually, get a boost. And the countries that can prove that will have an advantage compared to their competitors who might struggle to prove that their green industries are actually green. One thing that is worth noting about the CBAM actually is because of the WTO constraints, it's actually quite conservative and not as bad as it may seem. So if you can't prove your own green credentials, the EU will assume a certain level of embedded emissions for different products. And the WTO rules have made it such that the EU will have to assume the same embedded emissions as they're assuming in the European trading scheme. And that European trading scheme emissions will change and will actually, the assumed emissions will decrease over time as European industry decreases. So actually, the CBAM that you get charged, you might have an incredibly polluting industry in your country, but the CBAM that you get charged can never be worse than what the assumed emissions are from European industry, which tends to be cleaner. So it's actually not necessarily as bad as it might at first sound, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. The FDI question, I actually had never heard of the countervailing measures being used to claim, I guess it's anti-dumping, is it essentially that's being used? Anyway, I would love if you, I might try and chase you down afterwards to get examples of that, because that's something I had never heard of. Yeah.
So right now, Indonesia and also Egypt, the first case is in Egypt. So there's this product called, I don't know, maybe glass that was enjoying FDI from China. And then the EU countervailed that that said product, basing that the allegation because such product enjoying subsidies in the form of FDI from China. In the Indonesia case, right now we have we have a CVD from the EU saying that our nickel was enjoying subsidies in the form of FDI by from China. So I know it's absurd from any from a WTO law, but it's a real case in the EU right now. And then, but since the Egypt didn't have the resources to challenge the EU, it's up for Indonesia right now to challenge the EU, and it will be a hot issue. So, but what I want to say that is, if the EU were succeeded to without anyone challenging this absurd policy, it will discourage all the developing countries to receive FDI from, I don't know, China or any others. If such FDI can be challenged using CVD, we are talking CVD here, not anti-dumping, which is a new territorial difference from foreign direct investment, right? So to mix the two into one, I don't know, new regimes will be like.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I will follow up with you, because I'd like to understand more about it, but I won't take too much of everyone's time here. One thing for the rest of the audience who are maybe not all trade representatives, there is a couple of things that spring to mind with the China case. One is that it's not, of course, all foreign direct investment. I presume that it's state-owned enterprises or state-driven foreign investment. Otherwise, it would be very hard to make the subsidy claim. And that is indeed something that's been an issue with Chinese in their own domestic investment as well, the subsidies from the government, explicit or implicit, through low-cost credit and so on. So it won't discourage all investment from everywhere, but certainly investment from state-owned enterprises, which a lot of Chinese investment is, would quite possibly be threatened. I also found it very interesting that you mentioned nickel. And do you know, I'd be fascinated to what, was it really glass in the Egyptian caves?
Yes, it is either it's glass or fiber optics. I have to look for on a file.
Okay,
yeah,
fiber optic would make more sense to me than glass, because fiber optic and nickel fall in the same category of areas where the geoeconomic or geopolitical competition is getting really tough. So nickel is an element which is very important to the energy transition. And so in a sense, one of these critical minerals for the energy transition. And we know that China essentially controls 90% of global production of critical minerals currently. And so the rest of the world are getting pretty damn nervous, particularly the Europeans, given what they've seen about dependence for energy on Russia. And now they're desperately trying to get off fossil fuels as part of getting off their dependence on Russia. And they're realizing that that requires renewable energy, and that renewable energy requires critical minerals, which means they're going to be dependent on China. And so the nickel example does not surprise me at all, given that there's Chinese involvement in it. And so I'm not justifying this as fair or a good trade policy, but I think it is a space that's going to continue to hot up. Is control of critical minerals that we need for the energy transition. And we will see more of this sort of behavior, this overall around the world, we are seeing free trade being sacrificed because of the increasing bifurcation of the global economy and the competition between the sort of big powers geopolitically. And it's very sad to see, because it's going to cost us all our fair and relatively efficient global trading system.
Thank you very much, Emma and Cristiano. Emma, do you want to go to the summary now? We still have 2 questions, but I think we're running out of time. I will transfer the questions to the Moodle, so you can go there and answer the questions
great.
later.
All right. Well, thank you all for a really engaging session today. I've enjoyed it a lot. I've learned a lot myself. So thank you for everyone who's been involved. So in summary, we know that international trade and investment, as that conversation with Cristiano just pointed out, can be really important to driving a fair and efficient energy transition around the world. We also know that green industrial policy can help to drive a fast and efficient energy transition. The problem, however, is that not all the traditional policies to support trade and investment will also support the energy transition. And there is in particular, outright contradiction between the needs of green industrial policy and some of the traditional trade and investment policy advice. The other thing to bear in mind, while green industrial policy is becoming really popular and actually is becoming a really important part of our race to net zero, we won't get there without green industrial policy, but we also won't get there with bad green industrial policy. So it's really important when we're implementing green industrial policy to remember some good policy principles, and these same principles can actually also help to reduce the conflicts between industrial policy and trade and investment policy. So try and think about what is it that I'm trying to fix? Identify the market failure that needs government intervention as a starting point for any policy, and then try to target your policy intervention as closely as possible at the identified problem, at the identified market failure. Okay, so if the problem is that a natural resource is being depleted too quickly, the efficient solution is not to ban exports of those. It is to put some sort of resource rent or some sort of price on the extraction or harvest of that natural resource. That's an example of targeting policy at the market failure in order to reduce the conflicts between these policy areas. And finally, and our discussion about CBAMs hopefully really highlighted the importance of when you're designing a policy to target some climate or energy problem, some climate or energy market failure, that you have to go to a fair bit of effort to try to design that policy in the least trade and investment restricting way possible. For one thing, it's good policy if you do it that way. For another thing, you are likely to run into problems at the WTO, like the Europeans are doing at the moment, if you don't try to be as least trade restrictive as possible. So that's it for me today. Thank you, everyone, very much. I've really enjoyed this, and I'll follow up with people on the online platform. Thanks a lot, Tien and Tang.
Thanks a lot, Emma, for excellent presentation. Thanks a lot, Tien, for very effective facilitation. And especially thanks for all participants for great contribution, discussions, comments, and questions. I know that some of you still have some remaining questions that have not been answered in this session. Please go to the Moodle website, type in your questions and any information you like to share. And also thanks for our colleague for the initiative to put the discussion in the chat box to the website. We will do that, right? And if possible, we will do for all other previous sessions the same thing, so we can have the interactive review anytime you wish. Thanks everyone again very much, and look forward to seeing you virtually on the Moodle website discussion, and also in 2 weeks time in the next session.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks,
Nice to meet you
again. Have a great day. Bye bye.